Thank you, Alex. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and honoured guests. Before I begin, I would like to say a few words about a good friend and a great supporter of the Movement of Life that we sadly lost in February of this year. Piotr Stuglik was our first coordinator of the Movement of Life here in Poland, and he was actually a resident of Auschwitz. He was with us here at our annual Movement of Life meeting here last year, and we know we will miss him greatly. So in his honour, I would like to dedicate my talk tonight to him. I guess all of us today are familiar with the fact that governments are very much closely controlled by multinational corporations. These days, fewer and fewer people dispute this. What is less commonly known is the fact that this has been going on for a very, very long time now. Key events in the history of Europe, and indeed this planet, have been enormously influenced by the actions and the interests of multinational corporations. And in particular, the greatest and bloodiest war of the 20th century, the Second World War, and also events that took place here in Auschwitz, were the result of corporate sponsorship. The Second World War was not merely a war of conquest, we now know. It was an economic war being fought for the interests, in the interests of multinational corporations. And why is this important? This is important because unless we can learn the lessons of history, unless we can understand the mistakes that have been made in the past, we will not be able to build the truly democratic Europe, the better Europe that we all wish for. The story that I'll be telling you this evening is based upon documented history. 8 years ago, our foundation was able to obtain original copies of documents from the Nuremberg Tribunal that took place after World War II, where the executives and managers of the Ig-Farben cartel were tried for their crimes. These documents had essentially lain hidden for over 60 years at the point at which we put these online. They're still online today, and I would encourage all of you to read them and to download them for yourselves in order that we can all gain a better understanding of the history that has been denied to us. These are the documents, if you like, that history has forgotten. We know from these documents that the corporate preparations for World War II started as early as 1925. In 1925, Bayer, BASF, Hoechst, and other corporations came together to form the Ig-Farben cartel. And their goal was simple. It was a clear economic goal: gaining control of the emerging global markets in chemicals, petrochemicals, and pharmaceuticals. Within only 8 years, Ig-Farben had become the world's largest chemical and pharmaceutical cartel, and just as importantly, the biggest financier of the Nazis' rise to power. The documents from the Nuremberg trial against Ig-Farben show that Ig-Farben had invested over 80 million Reichsmark in the Nazis and their associated supporting organizations. 80 Reichsmark is an astonishing amount of money. In today's money, it would be around 800 million euros. At that time, 80 million Reichsmark was an enormous sum of money. Without this, the Nazis would surely have been unable to gain the control and power that they achieved. The strategy of Ig-Farben is laid out clearly in the documents from the Nuremberg trial against its managers. This was a letter written by Ig-Farben director Nerium to the Nazi government in 1940. And it shows clearly that the goal was a Europe under the leadership of the Nazis and their corporate benefactors, Ig-Farben. The letter also contains many things that today we would recognize from the Europe that has been brought about around us today. It talks about a common currency which we are now seeing today, of course, enslaves the people of Europe to financial dictatorship. The tragedies in the lives of the people in the southern Mediterranean countries bear witness to this. And of course, a common patent law was also talked about. This was essential in order to gain control of these markets in substances, chemicals, pharmaceuticals that could only be controlled through the issuing of patents. And finally, of course, one European appeal court was also needed under control of the German cartel. The German cartel not only wanted this court, it needed to be controlling it as well. 1 year later, saw the publication of the book that essentially, after the end of World War II, became used as the blueprint for the Brussels EU that we know today. It was called the Greater Sphere Cartel, an instrument of industrial market order in a new Europe. It was written by this man, Arno Scholter. He was the director of a Nazi research institute based in Dresden, in Germany. And if you look at what the book contains, look at the Europe that it describes. It contains many elements that we see around us today. It talks about, for example, the system of European directives. Directives are the principal means of lawmaking in Europe today. It talks about the concept of a European Commission. This is the unelected executive body that rules over Europe. The European Commissioners are the 28 most powerful technocrats in Europe today. And finally, it talks about something it calls a master agreement. A master enabling agreement to cement the dictatorship in Europe. And in 2007, this took shape and form in what we now know as the Lisbon Treaty. Whilst the concentration camp at Auschwitz and what happened there is relatively well known today, and quite rightly so, of course, the fact that there was an industrial complex built by Ig-Farben nearby to produce the chemicals and explosives needed for this conquest war. This fact is not so well known worldwide. People from around Auschwitz, of course, will know this site well because it still exists today. But you see, this industrial complex and the massive expansion of the concentration camps that took place in order to provide the source of slave labor that Ig-Farben needed for this site. This was financed with a loan of credits of almost 1 billion Reichsmark from Deutsche Bank. And the fact about this is that this site, IG Auschwitz, as it was known, was a 100% subsidiary of the Ig-Farben cartel. This is another fact that our history books have, at best, we would have to say, underreported. The fact that prisoners of Auschwitz were used as a source of slave labour at IG Auschwitz. The corporate aspects of this have not been fully described to the world. And the site, as I say, is still there today. The world knows about the Auschwitz concentration camp, but the world has not been told the truth about the corporate sponsorship that helped bring it about. Probably the most shocking aspect of the corporate sponsorship of Auschwitz comes from the fact that prisoners of Auschwitz were used as guinea pigs in deadly medical experiments. We have been told, of course, about the fact that there were experiments conducted. But essentially, what we have been led to believe was that these experiments were experiments conducted by crazy, perverted Nazis or such like. The reality is rather different. The reality is very different, in fact, because there were paid employees of Bayer, for example, such as this man, Dr. Helmut Vetter. Vetter was a paid employee and an SS doctor at Auschwitz. And he was involved in giving patented drugs, using these, forcibly using prisoners as guinea pigs at Auschwitz. Bayer benefited from this. These drugs, some of them ultimately went on to become the first generation of what we now know as chemotherapy drugs. The implications of this, the corporate implications of this, of course, are enormous. One can see straight away why we haven't been told the full truth about this. Because multinational pharmaceutical companies have since made countless billions of dollars of profits from substances that owe their roots to experiments that were forcibly conducted on prisoners at Auschwitz. We have all seen, of course, some of the horrific pictures of what took place. But the truth, the corporate implications of this have been denied to us. We have been denied the truth about how all of this came about and the corporate influences that still reign in Europe and indeed the world today. And even the Zyklon B that was used to kill millions of people in the gas chambers was supplied by an Ig-Farben subsidiary company, Degesh. So after the war, between 1947 and 1948, Ig-Farben managers were tried in the Nuremberg war crimes trials. In fact, there were 13 trials that took place in Nuremberg in all. The trial that history remembers and that most people are aware of was the first one, the trial against the so-called main war criminals, the Nazi leaders. After that, there were a series of 12 trials that took place. And of these subsequent trials, the Farben trial was the 6th one. What is most notable about this is that the chief US prosecutor at the Farben trial said specifically that without Ig-Farben, the Second World War would probably never have happened. You might think, after the horrendous crimes that these men were responsible for, that they would have been locked away and the key thrown away. ladies and gentlemen, this is not what happened. Take, for example, the example of Fritz Termeer. Termeer was one of the managers of Ig-Farben. Termeer was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. His crimes included slavery and mass murder. Crimes against humanity do not come more serious than this. And yet he was sentenced to only 7 years in prison. And he was released after serving only 2 of them. And then, in 1956, obviously fully aware that Termeer was a convicted war criminal, Bayer appointed him as chairman of its supervisory board, a post he went on to hold for 8 years. Looking around us today, we might ask ourselves, in some senses at least, what has changed? Because global drug sales are now worth $1 trillion a year. And as a direct result of the toxicity of these substances, as a direct result of the fact that they only attempt to treat symptoms, not the root causes of diseases, orthodox medicine is now the 3rd highest cause of death in the United States. Statistics in other industrialized countries suggest that the same is true elsewhere also. And of course, information on safe, non-patentable, natural therapies is being deliberately obstructed, including through law. I talked earlier a little bit about EU directives and their origins in the book that was produced in Dresden in the department of Arno Schulte. Let's take a little look at how EU directives are created today. In any normal democracy, the idea is that the parliament creates the laws. The people elect their politicians, and the politicians create the laws. This is not what happens in Europe today. Pharma and chemical cartel executives have direct access to European commissioners. In some cases, their industries actually form committees to do the first drafts of directives for Europe. And then the first issuing of a text that we learn about comes through the unelected European Commission that I talked about earlier. The European Commission issues the first public draft of the laws for Europe and then hands them down to the so-called Parliament. But this is no real Parliament. This is just a fig leaf to democracy. The Brussels EU Parliament has very little scope to make alterations to the laws that are passed to it by the Commission. And finally, of course, when these laws are essentially rubber-stamped by the Parliament, they are handed down to our governments. The people who are not fully aware of this point to their governments and say, how come my government is not representing me? There are some people, of course, who place the blame on the European Parliament and say, how come the European Parliament is not acting in our interests? But you see, there is a chain of command here. And the chain of command ultimately ends in the offices of the executives of the companies that together make up the cartel. So what we have in the Brussels EU is not simply a dictatorship, it's a corporate dictatorship. The people are not able to elect the executive body of their government. Jean-Claude Juncker is the current president of the Brussels EU, but his name never appeared on any ballot paper. We, the people, never had a chance to put a tick or a cross in a box of his or any other name. That option was not available to us because we are not supposed to have any direct influence over this unelected commission that rules over us. Equally, the Parliament has no right for independent lawmaking. This is not a democracy. This is, by any definition, a dictatorship. If you doubt any of this, if you truly believe that the Brussels EU is acting in your interests, consider what has happened with the euro currency. You see, we have been led to believe that the euro currency crisis, as it is called, happened by accident. We have been led to believe that this could not have been foreseen and that the consequences of this were just unlucky accidents. The truth is completely the opposite. In fact, in 2001, a business newspaper in my country, the Financial Times, quoted in an interview the then president of the European Commission, Romano Prodi. What Prodi said at that time was not really noticed, but if you look back now at the reality of the words, they are truly terrifying. Listen, he said, "I am sure the euro will oblige us to introduce a new set of economic policy instruments." He said, "It is politically impossible to propose that now, but someday there will be a crisis and new instruments will be created." In simple English, this means that they knew full well that the design of the euro was flawed. It was obvious to many people at the time, and they knew it full well. But they knew that the design of the euro would result, in Prodi's own words, in a crisis. And at that point, they would then be able to implement the financial controls that they wanted to implement all along. We only have to look at the reality of what is happening in Greece today to understand that the Brussels EU is not acting in our interests. With a quarter of the working population of Greece now unemployed, bankruptcies rife, and children going hungry, it is no wonder, is it, that the people of Greece elected a government and are demanding change. But you see, what is the response of the Brussels EU to this? Is it acting to solve the growing humanitarian crisis in Greece? Of course it isn't. In fact, quite the opposite. German leader Angela Merkel and the Brussels EU have chosen to ignore the crisis. The fact that there are children going hungry in Greece is completely secondary at best to the fact that they are insisting on repayment of the Greek debts. Ultimately, the good news, of course, from our perspective, is the fact that the beginning of the end of the Brussels EU is already underway. Since the first Brussels EU Parliament election in 1979, the voter turnout has fallen with every successive election. As the Brussels EU has grown, as the population has grown to become 500 million people today, the proportion of that population who see the Brussels EU as elected democratic leaders continues to fall. Clearly, we cannot continue like this. It is up to us, the people of Europe, to decide what happens next. As Alex described, 8 years ago, we came to Auschwitz, and together with our honoured guests, the survivors of Auschwitz, we issued a call for a Europe for the people, by the people. Because this is the only model of Europe This is the only model for any governing structure that ultimately can work. Unless a governing structure has the support of the people, it will never be truly a democracy. You can sign, as many thousands of other people have already done, you can sign this petition online. The goal being not simply to sign it, but to use it as a platform towards becoming active. We believe, my colleagues and I, the Movement of Life and our foundation, that the best place, the right place, the only place for the new Europe to begin is right here in Auschwitz. The survivors of Auschwitz and the people of Auschwitz are the guardians of history and the people who can help us lead the way towards a better Europe and a better world. You can learn more about the things I've been talking about in this book, authored by myself, Dr. Rath, Dr. Nusviki, and a survivor, August Kowalczak, who is sadly no longer with us. Together, we believe very strongly in the concept of a better Europe and a better world. We're very grateful for everything that all of you are doing coming tonight. Thank you very, very much.